15th of August 1842, Marshall Street, Holbeck, Leeds. A mob of thousands, many of them armed, surges toward a pair of factory gates. Behind those gates stands an Egyptian temple. Lotus columns, carved hieroglyphs, smoke rising from the stonework into a Yorkshire sky. At its height, this was the largest single room in the world. 2,000 workers passed through those gates every morning. The youngest were 9 years old. For nearly a century, the temple consumed their breath, their hearing, their childhoods. Then in 1886, it swallowed something harder to digest, its own purpose. The machinery was auctioned off by weight. The linen thread went cold, and the temple was left standing, as temples tend to do, long after the empire that raised it had ceased to exist. Why does a man who spins flax build himself a pharaoh's monument? And when the answer comes, piece by piece, life by life, what does it reveal about ambition, about beauty, and about the price paid by those who never got to choose? The gates are open. In 1787, a young man of 22 inherited 9,000 pounds and a linen draper's shop on Briggate, Leeds. By any measure of the time, this was a modest inheritance. Enough to live on, not enough to matter. Most men in his position would have kept the shop, married sensibly, and died in the same street they were born on. John Marshall was not most men. He had grown up watching cloth move through his father's hands. Bolts of linen, linen thread, linen yarn spun by cottage workers across the West Riding. He understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent his childhood behind a counter, that the real money was never in selling cloth. The real money was in making it, and making it, he had noticed, was about to change entirely. Across England in the 1780s, inventors were tearing apart the old way of doing things. Cotton had already been mechanized. Arkwright's water frame, Hargreaves' spinning jenny, Crompton's mule. The cottage industry that had clothed the country for centuries was being pulled, quite literally, into the machine age. But flax, the plant from which linen is spun, had resisted every attempt to mechanize it. Flax fiber is coarse, brittle, and unforgiving. Feed it through cotton machinery and it snaps. Nobody had yet solved the problem, and unsolved problems, Marshall had concluded, were simply opportunities wearing a disguise. In 1788, he leased Scotland Mill in Adel, a village north of Leeds, and formed a partnership with a young mechanic named Matthew Murray. Together they did what the textile industry had failed to do for a decade. They adapted cotton spinning machinery to handle flax. It was not an elegant solution. It required constant adjustment, repeated failure, and the kind of stubborn empirical persistence that distinguished genuine engineers from mere tinkerers. Murray supplied the mechanical intelligence. Marshall supplied the money, the drive, and a commercial instinct so sharp they were almost predatory. The partnership worked, and then Marshall made his first significant calculation. He could see by the early 1780s that the business was going to outgrow Murray and outgrow Adel. He needed capital, space, and, above all, control. He brought in new partners, Thomas and Benjamin Benyon, Shrewsbury wool merchants with money to invest. By 1795, they held a controlling interest, and Marshall found himself a minority shareholder in his own enterprise. It was an uncomfortable position for a man of his temperament, and he resolved it with characteristic efficiency. By 1804, he had bought them out entirely. As junior partners, he appointed two men from the factory floor, John Hives and William Hutton, chosen, as one contemporary account put it, because they could be relied upon not to go against his wishes. The hierarchy was now precisely as Marshall intended, himself at the top, loyal lieutenants below, and beneath them, the machinery. By this point, the business had relocated to Water Lane in Holbeck, the industrial district wedged between Leeds city center and the River Aire. It was a practical choice: good canal access, cheap land, a workforce of men and women already habituated to textile labor. Marshall built a new factory here, powered by a steam engine supplied by Bolton and Watt, the same Birmingham firm that had built the engines transforming industries across Britain. By 1803, his was the largest flax spinning operation in England. He was 38 years old. What drove him was not comfort. Marshall had grown up in trade, not in the gentry, and he carried that chip with the focus of a man who knows exactly what he is trying to prove. He read voraciously science, engineering, political economy. He corresponded with manufacturers and reformers. He tracked his competitors with the attention of a general studying enemy positions, and he paid close attention to the one thing that flax spinning required above all other considerations. The thing that made his industry different from cotton, different from wool, different from anything else being made in the north of England. Flax demands moisture. Linen thread, if allowed to dry out, becomes brittle and breaks under tension. To spin it reliably, the air around it must be kept permanently warm and damp, at least 70 degrees Fahrenheit, thick with humidity. Marshall understood this not as a problem, but as a design constraint. Every decision he made, the layout of his floors, the height of his ceilings, the placement of his engines, was shaped by the needs of the fiber rather than the comfort of the people handling it. That distinction, quietly embedded in the logic of the business from its very first years, would echo forward through everything that followed. The factory was growing, the orders were growing, and somewhere at the edge of Marshall's thinking, a larger idea was beginning to take shape, something that went beyond profit, beyond production, beyond the accumulated practicalities of running the largest flax mill in England. John Marshall wanted to build something that would last, something that people would look at and understand, immediately and without explanation, what kind of man he was. He would get his chance, but first the machines needed feeding. By the time the second decade of the 19th century arrived, John Marshall's operation in Holbeck had ceased to be merely a factory. It had become something closer to a system, a self-reinforcing engine of production that grew not by accident, but by deliberate, relentless design. Each new mill building fed the next. Each technological advance unlocked a further one, and at the center of it all, Marshall watched the numbers with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had always known this moment was coming. The physical expansion was methodical. Mill B had risen in 1794, built adjacent to the original water lane site to accommodate the surge in orders that the early machinery had made possible. Mill C followed in 1815, 6 stories of brick and iron. Mill D in 1820 negs. Mill E, which ran along the roadside and joined C to D in a single connected mass of production, was completed in 1831. Each building was larger than the last. Each one pushed the operations capacity further beyond anything its competitors could match. By the early 1830s, the complex at Marshall Street covered a substantial portion of Holbeck, and the sound of its machinery, the rhythmic thud of power looms, the hiss of steam, the grinding of 10,000 moving parts, was as permanent a feature of the neighborhood as the church bells. Then in 1829 came the development that changed everything. The wet spinning process had been known about in theory for some years, but Marshall's engineers were among the first to implement it at industrial scale. The principle was straightforward. By passing flax fiber through heated troughs of water immediately before spinning, the fiber became supple enough to be drawn out into a much finer and more consistent thread than dry spinning had ever allowed. The quality improvement was dramatic. Marshall's yarn, already the best on the English market, became finer still, and the demand for it rose accordingly. The transition took 5 years to complete across the full mill complex. It was disruptive, expensive, and at times chaotic. Marshall pressed on regardless. By the mid-1830s, the results were plain. More than 2,000 workers passed through the gates of the Holbeck complex every morning, 6 days a week. 7,000 spindles ran on steam power, producing linen yarn at a volume that would have been incomprehensible to the cottage workers whose trade this industry had displaced a generation earlier. John Marshall was, without serious dispute, the largest flax spinner in England, possibly in the world. The money this generated was extraordinary. Marshall's personal fortune, accumulated over 4 decades of manufacturing, is estimated to have reached somewhere between £1.5 and £2.5 million, a sum that placed him comfortably among the wealthiest men in Britain, and one that required, in the custom of the age, appropriate expression. He maintained a townhouse in Headingley. He purchased Halsteads, a substantial estate on the shores of Ullswater in the Lake District, where he could entertain on a scale befitting a man of his standing. He served as Member of Parliament for Yorkshire from 1826 to 1830, not because politics particularly interested him, but because a man of his wealth was expected to, and John Marshall had never been inclined to fall short of expectation. Beyond Parliament, he involved himself in the intellectual life of Leeds with the same methodical energy he brought to manufacturing. He was a founding figure of the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society and of the Leeds Mechanics Institute, institutions that reflected his conviction that knowledge, like capital, should be accumulated, organized, and put to productive use. That the workers in his own mills rarely had access to either institution was a tension he appears never to have found particularly troubling. What absorbed him increasingly, as the 1830s wore on, was the question of legacy. Not the legacy of the business itself, that he regarded as self-sustaining, capable of running without his daily attention, but something more visible, more permanent. He had built an empire of production. He wanted to build something that spoke to a different kind of ambition entirely, something that announced in stone and iron and the grandeur of its conception that the man who had started with £9,000 in a draper's shop on Breguet had arrived somewhere that mattered. The management of the mills had by now passed substantially to his son, James Garth Marshall. The elder Marshall still held the reins of the wider business, still made the large decisions, still reviewed the accounts with the precision of a man who had never entirely trusted anyone else's arithmetic. But it was James who walked the factory floors, James who dealt with the foreman, James who understood at the level of daily operational detail what it actually meant to run a complex of this size. Father and son were, in temperament, quite different men. John driven by acquisition and proof, James by a desire to consolidate and improve, and the business in his transition between them was beginning to reflect both sets of instincts simultaneously. The empire was at its zenith. The order books were full, the machinery ran without pause, and John Marshall, in his 70s now, was allowing himself to think about what he wanted to leave behind. Not in a will, but in a building. Something extraordinary. Something that would make people stop in the street and stare. He had been spending time with the Leeds Philosophical Society. They had recently acquired an Egyptian mummy, the priest Nesyamun, unwrapped and examined before a paying audience in 1824. Egypt was everywhere in the cultural imagination of educated Victorians. Ancient, vast, mysterious, and, crucially for a man in Marshall's trade, the original home of the linen industry. The pharaohs had wrapped their dead in it. The priests of the Nile had worn it. What better form, then, for the crowning achievement of England's greatest flax empire? He would build a temple. In 1836, on a plot of land adjoining the existing mill complex on Marshall Street, workmen broke ground on a building unlike anything the industrial north of England had ever attempted. There were no precedents for what was being planned here. No pattern book to consult, no established tradition of Egyptian revival factory architecture to draw upon. There was only a brief, an ambition, and three men whose combined talents were, in retrospect, precisely suited to the task. Joseph Bonomi the Younger was an Egyptologist before he was an architect, a scholar who had spent years in the Nile Valley recording temple inscriptions, studying proportions, learning the precise grammar of ancient Egyptian stonework. When James Garth Marshall approached him about the design of the new mill, Bonomi brought with him not an approximation of Egypt, but a working knowledge of it. The lotus columns he specified were drawn from actual temples. The hieroglyphs carved into the facade were not decorative invention. They were accurate transcriptions of ancient texts. The building would look like Egypt because one of its designers had been there, had measured it, had understood it at a level that went far beyond anything available in a pattern book. David Roberts, the celebrated painter, contributed his own direct experience of the ancient world. He had traveled to the Temple of Karnak on the Nile specifically to study Egyptian flax cultivation, the crop that had clothed the pharaohs and their priests for 3,000 years, and returned to Leeds with notebooks full of drawings and a clear sense of how the visual language of that civilization should translate into brick and iron on a Yorkshire street. The engineer James Coombe, a former pupil of John Rennie, provided the structural intelligence that would allow the romantic ambition of the design to stand up under 4,000 tons of roof. Between the three of them, the building had every chance of becoming exactly what Marshall intended. Construction took 4 years. What rose on Marshall Street between 1836 and 1840 was, by every measurable standard, extraordinary. The main mill range ran to 396 feet in length and 216 feet in width, a single floor covering nearly 2 acres of ground beneath one continuous roof. 72 brick arches, each supported by a cast iron column styled in the manner of papyrus bundles, held up a roof that weighed in excess of 4,000 tons. 66 conical glass domes, each 11 feet 6 inches in height and 48 feet in circumference, pierced the roof at regular intervals to flood the floor below with natural light. Beneath the floor, a system of ventilation tunnels distributed warm air throughout the building, maintaining a constant working temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The total cost of construction, including machinery, exceeded £200,000. The choice of Egyptian design was not merely aesthetic. Marshall and his son were members of the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society, which had recently acquired a remarkable object. The mummy of the Theban priest Nesyamun, examined before a paying audience in Leeds in 1824. Egypt occupied a particular place in the Victorian imagination. Ancient, authoritative, and, for Marshall's purposes, historically significant in a way that suited his industry precisely. Egypt was where linen had begun. The priests of the Nile had worn it. The pharaohs had been wrapped in it. To build a linen mill in the form of an Egyptian temple was, by the internal logic of a classically educated Victorian industrialist, not an affectation, but a statement of lineage. This was where Flax had always been going. Leeds was simply the latest chapter. There was one practical difficulty that no amount of classical scholarship had anticipated. The roof, in order to insulate the working floor and maintain the humidity that flax spinning demanded, was covered with a layer of pitch and earth on which grass was seeded and allowed to grow. Grass required cutting, and the most efficient cutters available in 1840 were sheep. A small flock was duly installed on the roof of the largest industrial building in the world, and immediately presented its keepers with an unanticipated engineering problem. Sheep cannot climb stairs. Getting them onto the roof required a solution that did not yet exist. The result was the construction of a hydraulic lift, one of the earliest such devices in recorded history, installed for the sole purpose of moving livestock to an altitude where they could perform their function as living lawnmowers. It was, in its way, a perfect encapsulation of the Victorian industrial mind. Confronted with an absurd problem, solve it with an invention. The building opened in June 1840. John Marshall, 75 years old and in the final years of his life, marked the occasion with a temperance tea for the firm's 2,600 workers. Every man, woman, and child who had any connection to the Marshall enterprise invited to sit down together in the shadow of their employer's monument. It was a gesture of paternalistic generosity entirely consistent with Marshall's self-image, and entirely consistent, too, with a certain carefully maintained distance from the daily realities of what happened inside his buildings. Within the year, the machinery had been installed and production had begun. From the outside, Temple Works was breathtaking. A pharaoh's monument dropped into the back streets of Holbeck, absurd and magnificent in equal measure. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Step through the gates of Temple Works on any working morning in the 1840s, and the first thing that strikes you is not the architecture, it is the air. The air inside the mill is not the air of the street outside, not the damp, coal-tinged air of Holbeck, which is itself no particular pleasure. The air inside Temple Works is something thicker, warmer, and more insistent. It sits in the lungs like wet cloth. It settles on the skin within seconds of entry. The ventilation tunnels beneath the floor push it through the building at a constant 70 degrees Fahrenheit, keeping the atmosphere precisely calibrated to the needs of the fiber being processed. The linen thread requires this warmth, this moisture, this particular quality of enveloping humidity. Without it, the yarn becomes brittle. It snaps. Production falters. The air inside Temple Works is, in every meaningful sense, engineered for flax. The people breathing it were a secondary consideration. This was not an oversight. It was the logic of the industry made physical. Flax spinning was, by its nature, a wet and hot business, and every mill in Leeds operated under broadly similar conditions. What distinguished Temple Works was simply its scale. Nearly 2 acres of that air, enclosed beneath a single roof, with no meaningful relief available to those who worked within it. Windows were kept to a minimum to preserve the internal climate. The ventilation system that Marshall's engineers were so proud of was designed to distribute warmth, not to refresh it. A worker who spent 12 hours inside that building in July was not working in a factory so much as inside a maintained environment, one calibrated to the precise requirements of everything except human comfort. The workforce that filled this environment was, by any modern reckoning, deeply troubling in its composition. 40% of those employed at the Marshall Mills were young women between the ages of 13 and 20. A further 20% were children below the age of 13. They worked 72 hours every week, 6 days of 12 hours each, performing tasks that range from piecing together broken threads to the process known as heckling, the combing and separating of raw flax fibers in preparation for spinning. Heckling was the job given most frequently to the youngest workers, and it was the most dangerous in one specific and invisible way. The process released clouds of fine flax dust into the air around the worker. Particles light enough to hang suspended for extended periods, fine enough to pass deep into the lungs. Nobody in 1840 had a reliable name for what this did to the human respiratory system over years of exposure. They simply knew that mill workers coughed. They coughed chronically, persistently, progressively. And they went back the next morning because there was nothing else. In 1832, a political pamphlet circulating in Leeds made a specific allegation against the Marshall operation. A boy of 9 years old, it was claimed, had been stripped to the skin, bound to one of the mill's iron pillars, and beaten with leather straps by an overseer until he lost consciousness. Marshall's supporters disputed the account vigorously. Marshall himself denied that such treatment was sanctioned or permitted in his mills. The truth of that specific incident has never been definitively established. What is beyond dispute is the context in which it was alleged: a workforce heavy with children, a production environment in which speed and output were paramount, and a supervisory structure in which the authority of overseers over the workers beneath them was near absolute. Marshall, to his credit, drew a line in certain places. Overseers in his mills were formally forbidden from using corporal punishment, a prohibition that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries and that he pointed to with some consistency when the subject of his management practices arose. He had fans installed to improve air circulation, though the primary purpose was humidity management rather than worker comfort. In 1844, he and the neighboring firm Taylor, Wordsworth and Company organized an away excursion to Liverpool for their workers, an initiative so unusual that the editor of the Leeds Mercury, a notably liberal publication, admitted to some unease at the novelty of it. These were not the gestures of a man entirely indifferent to the human beings in his employ. They were, however, the gestures of a man who had decided, at some fundamental level, where the boundary of his responsibility lay. Children could work in his mills because children worked in every mill. The hours were long because long hours were the industry standard. The air was difficult to breathe because breathable air was not what the machinery required. Within those parameters, Marshall was, by the measure of his own time and class, considered progressive. By any other measure, the temple was built on the labor of people who had no practical choice but to enter it. It was into this world that John Richardson had inserted himself sometime in the 1820s. Richardson was not a member of the Marshall family, not a shareholder, not a man of any particular social standing. He was a manager, one of those indispensable, largely invisible figures on whom industrial enterprises of this scale quietly depend. He had worked his way into a position of real authority within the mills, accumulating over the years a detailed operational knowledge that made him, in practical terms, more essential to the daily running of the business than any member of the family above him. He knew which machines were wearing. He knew which foremen were effective and which were not. He knew the rhythms of the workforce in a way that the Marshalls, increasingly distant from the factory floor, simply could not. Richardson installed several of his friends and relations in senior positions, at salaries of between £300 and £500 a year. Whether this was corruption or simply the habit of a man who trusted what he knew, it was a pattern that would have consequences. In the short term, it kept the operation running. In the longer term, it created a managerial layer whose loyalty was to Richardson rather than to the firm, and whose existence would become, in time, a subject of considerable bitterness within the Marshall family. For now, though, the machines ran. The thread was produced, the orders were filled, and the thousands of men, women, and children inside the temple went about their work in the warm, dense, flax-scented air, under columns carved in the likeness of the Nile. Until the morning the crowd arrived at the gate. The summer of 1842 was not a good summer to own a factory in the north of England. Across Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the Midlands, a wave of industrial unrest had been building since spring, fed by wage cuts, unemployment, and the accumulated grievances of a working population that had been absorbing the costs of the Industrial Revolution for 2 generations without sharing meaningfully in its rewards. By August, the unrest had a name: the Plug Riots, so called because striking workers moved from mill to mill, pulling the plugs from factory boilers, stopping the engines and forcing production to halt, were spreading across the manufacturing districts with a speed that alarmed factory owners and terrified local magistrates in equal measure. On the morning of 15th of August 1842, the movement reached Holbeck. The Leeds annals describe what followed with careful restraint, but the facts were plain enough. A crowd of several thousand people, many of them armed with sticks, stones, and tools, surged along Marshall Street and gathered outside the gates of Temple Works. The vicinity of the mill, the annals recorded, was completely crammed with an excited mob. The gates held, but the situation around them did not. In the streets nearby, machinery at adjacent workshops was disabled. Windows were broken. The message being delivered was unambiguous. The mill would stop, one way or another, and the people outside its gates were prepared to ensure it. Inside, the response was what it always was in such circumstances. The machinery was shut down, the workers stood back, and the owners waited. Marshall's mills were not the only target that day. The riots swept across Leeds and its surroundings, touching dozens of sites before the military was called in to restore order. Production at Temple Works was suspended for several days. The immediate crisis passed without the gates being breached. What did not pass was the underlying condition that had produced the crisis. The Marshall family, once order was restored, expressed relief and moved on. The wage structure remained as it was. The hours remained as they were. The children remained at their posts. The plug rioters had demonstrated with considerable force that the patience of the Leeds working population had limits. The owners of Leeds had heard the demonstration and noted it. And then, with the quiet confidence of men who controlled the employment, they continued as before. It would take another 29 years before the gates of Temple Works were shaken again. And this time, the challenge came not from a mob in the street, but from inside the mill itself. On 11 August 1871, 600 operatives at the Water Lane Mills laid down their work and walked out. Their demand was straightforward: a 10% increase in wages. The sum involved was not extravagant. The principle it represented, however, that workers inside a Marshall mill might collectively withdraw their labor and expect to be negotiated with rather than dismissed, was one that the management found considerably more threatening than the arithmetic. John Richardson's response was immediate and total. The following morning, he closed every Marshall mill in Holbeck, all of them, not just the ones whose workers had struck, but the entire complex, Temple Works, the Water Lane Mills, every building in the operation. It was a calculated act of overwhelming force. If the workers wanted to stop production, Richardson would stop it for them on his terms and at a cost to the workforce that would vastly exceed whatever wages they were seeking. The lockout was not a concession. It was a punishment. The Marshall family, watching from a remove that had grown considerably more comfortable since the days of John Marshall's personal involvement, were brought into the direct engagement with the crisis. Stephen Marshall, a member of the third generation, a man who had inherited a share of the empire without inheriting any particular appetite for running it, traced the unrest specifically to Temple Works. The workers there were, in his recorded assessment, as bad a lot of men as we have. His proposed remedy was characteristic of the family's instincts by this point. He suggested the public dismissal of the Temple Works foreman, conducted in such a manner as to ruin him professionally, as a signal to the workforce of what resistance would cost. Other members of the family talked him back from this position. Negotiations opened. They dragged on for days, long enough for the Leeds Mercury to publish an article that attracted considerable attention across the city. The piece drew a direct and deliberate contrast between the poverty and insecurity of a mill worker's life and the spending habits and accumulated luxury of the Marshall family. It was not a comfortable read for the Marshalls, and they knew it. The damage to their public reputation was real, and the calculations shifted accordingly. The 10% increase was conceded. The mills reopened. The workers returned to the temple and the thread in the warm, dense air. On the surface, it looked like resolution. A dispute begun, negotiated, and closed. Beneath the surface, a different resolution had been reached in private. The Marshall family, humiliated by the Mercury's coverage and furious at the defiance of the Temple Works workforce in particular, determined quietly that they would deal with the troublemakers in the long term. The names had been noted, the faces remembered. Patience in the Marshall household had always been a strategic virtue, but the long term, as it turned out, was not going to belong to the Marshall family. Something had already begun outside the walls of the temple, something none of them had found a way to stop or had even fully understood was happening until it was considerably advanced. The world was changing materials, and linen was losing. The decline of Marshalls of Leeds did not arrive like the plug riots, sudden, loud, and visible from the street. It arrived the way most institutional declines arrive, gradually, then all at once, and by the time anyone inside the organization fully acknowledged it, the damage was already structural. The first pressure came from abroad. For the first 2 decades of John Marshall's operation, English flax spinners had enjoyed a practical monopoly on mechanized linen production. The machinery was British, the expertise was British, and the competitors in Ireland, France, and Belgium were still largely dependent on cottage-based hand spinning. Free trade in machinery changed this with a speed that the industry had not anticipated. By the late 1840s, the same mechanical processes that Marshall had spent decades refining were available to any manufacturer on the continent with the capital to purchase them. Irish mills in particular expanded rapidly, producing yarn of equivalent quality at lower cost. Lower wages, lower overheads, closer proximity to the Atlantic flax trade. The competitive advantage that Marshall had built his empire on was not lost overnight. It was eroded quarter by quarter, order by order, until the firm found itself competing on price in a market where it could no longer win on quality alone. The second pressure was more fundamental and more final. Cotton was destroying linen, not by force, not by legislation, but by the simple logic of the market. Cotton cloth was cheaper to produce, easier to launder, more comfortable against the skin in the warmer months, and available in a widening range of weights and weaves that were encroaching on every traditional application of linen. Shirts that had been linen for 2 centuries became cotton. Household linens, tablecloths, bed sheets, the domestic fabric of the Victorian home, migrated steadily toward cotton alternatives. The demand for linen yarn, which had seemed in 1840 as permanent and expansive as the demand for any staple material, began to contract. Not catastrophically, not at first, but with the remorseless consistency of a tide going out. By 1850, the firm had ceased to be reliably profitable. After 1850, it would never fully recover. John Marshall did not live to see the worst of it. He died in 1845, 5 years after the opening of Temple Works, at the age of 80. He left behind a fortune, a complex of mill buildings covering much of Holbeck, and a family that was about to discover the difference between inheriting wealth and inheriting the capacity to generate it. His son, James Garth Marshall, who had built Temple Works, who had walked the factory floors while his father counted the returns, became the dominant figure in the business after 1845. James was, by contemporary accounts, an intelligent and conscientious man, and he understood better than anyone what the firm was facing. He attempted to consolidate operations, to cut costs where cutting was possible, to find new markets for the yarn that the continental competition had not yet penetrated. For a time, the sheer scale of the Marshall operation gave it a resilience that smaller competitors lacked. But resilience is not the same as momentum, and James Garth Marshall, for all his competence, could not reverse what the market had decided. What made the situation worse, considerably, irreversibly worse, was what was happening to the family itself. John Marshall had built his empire through a combination of technical intelligence, commercial ruthlessness, and an almost physical inability to accept defeat. His sons had inherited the enterprise. His grandsons, the third generation, had inherited the income. And somewhere in that transmission, something essential had been lost. By the 1860s and 1870s, the third generation Marshalls were, almost without exception, no longer living in Leeds. They had moved to country estates, to London, to the comfortable peripheries of Victorian upper-middle-class life that their grandfather's money had made available. The mills that paid for their existence were managed by John Richardson and a layer of salaried employees whose loyalties and competencies varied considerably. The family retained nominal authority, attended meetings when required, reviewed accounts when pressed. But the daily operational engagement that John Marshall had maintained until the last years of his life, the presence in the factory, the direct knowledge of what was being made and how and at what cost, had evaporated across 2 generations of comfortable distance. James Garth Marshall died in 1873. He had carried the business further than it had any right to survive, given the market conditions of the 1850s and 1860s, and he left it still functioning, barely, and at loss more often than not, but functioning. His passing removed the last member of the family with both the will and the capacity to manage the enterprise in any meaningful sense. After 1873, the firm made a loss in the majority of its remaining trading years. In 21 of its final 40 years of operation, it did not return a profit. By the early 1880s, Temple Works had already been quietly sublet to outside tenants. It was no longer a net expense to the business, only because the business had, in effect, surrendered it. The great room that had once been described as the largest in the world now belonged, for practical purposes, to whoever was willing to pay rent on it. What remained of the Marshall partnership by 1884 was 2 men. John Marshall III, born 1840, and his brother Stephen, born 1843. They were the grandsons of the founder, and they were done. John refused to continue. Stephen had considered emigrating to America, a detail that would have appalled their grandfather, who had built the largest flax mill in England, precisely so that his descendants would never need to go anywhere. Neither man was willing to put further capital into a business that had been hemorrhaging money for 3 decades. Neither was willing to buy the other out. The only remaining option was the one that nobody in the family had wanted to say aloud: closure, and everything that came with it. The empire that John Marshall had spent a lifetime constructing, the mills, the machinery, the thread, the temple, would be sold, all of it, piece by piece, to whoever would take it. The only question was when. The notice appeared in the spring of 1886. Marshall and Company of Leeds, flax spinners, established 1788, operators of the largest single-room factory ever constructed in the industrial world, would be wound up. Its assets, accumulated across nearly a century of production, would be offered for sale by public auction. Interested parties were invited to attend. It is worth pausing on what that notice represented. In 1788, John Marshall had leased a small mill in Adel with borrowed capital and an unproven idea. In the 98 years since, his firm had mechanized an industry, employed thousands of people across multiple generations of the same families, produced yarn that clothed a significant portion of the British population, and raised on a back street in Holbeck a building so extraordinary that engineers and architects had traveled from across the country to study it. 98 years. Now the whole of it, every spindle, every beam engine, every brick-vaulted arch and papyrus bundle column, was to be disposed of at whatever price the market would bear. The auctioneers moved through the complex with the brisk efficiency of men for whom sentiment is an occupational hazard. Everything was cataloged. Everything was numbered. The spinning frames that had run on wet process technology, introduced in 1829, the innovation that had once given Marshalls an unassailable edge over every competitor in England, were assessed for their scrap value. The power looms, the preparation machinery, the boilers, the drive shafts, the thousands of individual components that together had constituted the most productive flax spinning operation in the country, were reduced one by one to line items on an auctioneer's list. Inside temple works, the process had a particular quality of desolation. The 66 conical glass domes that had flooded the working floor with light for 46 years still admitted the same Yorkshire sky. The cast iron columns, styled in the manner of papyrus bundles and carrying the weight of a 4,000-ton roof, still stood in their precise rows across the 2-acre floor. But the machinery they had sheltered was being stripped out around them, moved to the loading bay, assessed, sold, and carried away to mills in other towns, or to the foundries that would melt it down and begin again. The temple was being emptied of everything that had given it a reason to exist. Among the buyers were manufacturers from across the north of England, men who had no particular interest in the history of what they were purchasing and every interest in what it could do for them operationally. A spinning frame was a spinning frame. A boiler was a boiler. That this particular boiler had run inside a building modeled on the Temple of Horus at Edfu, that it had been tended by workers, some of whom had been doing so since the 1840s, that it had kept running through riots and strikes and the slow generational collapse of the family that owned it, none of this affected the price. The rest of the fixed assets followed in due course. The mill buildings, C, D, and E, the brick and iron structures that had risen across Holbeck between 1815 and 1831, were sold to textile interests that would continue to use them for other purposes. Temple Works itself, the Grade 1 monument to Victorian industrial ambition, was purchased by a Leeds clothing manufacturer named James Rhodes. The Egyptian temple that had been built to spin flax would become a garment factory. The lotus columns would look down on different machinery, different workers, a different product. The building would survive. The purpose for which it had been built would not. By the time the auction concluded, the Marshall firm had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The name remained briefly on some administrative paperwork. The buildings remained standing. But the enterprise, the accumulation of capital, machinery, knowledge, and human labor that John Marshall had set in motion in 1788, was gone, dispersed into the wider economy in pieces, like a clock taken apart and sold spring by spring. 98 years. Ended not by fire, not by flood, not by any single dramatic catastrophe, but by the quiet arithmetic of a market that had simply moved on to cheaper alternatives and left the temple behind. The hammer fell for the last time. The sale was complete. When the machinery was gone, what remained was the silence. It arrived in stages, the way silence always does in a place that has known continuous noise. First, the looms stopped. Their rhythmic thudding, which had been as constant a feature of the Holbeck soundscape as rain on cobblestones, simply ceased. Then the beam engines wound down, their great pistons slowing through diminishing arcs until they stopped at angles they had never held before, caught mid-stroke, going nowhere. Then the drive shafts, which had transmitted power to every corner of the building through a network of belts and pulleys, came to rest. And then there was only the sound of the building itself, the creak of cooling iron, the drip of condensation from the ventilation ducts, the wind moving through the glass domes above. The workers who had been employed at Marshall's in its final years were not, for the most part, long-serving veterans of the mill's great decades. The workforce had contracted steadily since the 1860s as orders fell, and the family reduced headcount to slow the hemorrhage of money. Those who remained in 1886 were largely the people who had nowhere else to go, older men and women for whom the mill had been the only consistent employer of their adult lives, younger workers who had inherited their positions from parents who had themselves inherited from the generation before. For these people, the closure was not an abstraction. It was the end of a livelihood in a neighborhood that offered limited alternatives. They left in the way people leave a place that has consumed years of their lives without quite belonging to them, without ceremony, without the luxury of sentiment, carrying whatever personal items they had kept at their stations, and walking out through gates that, for the first time in nearly a century, would not open again at 5 o'clock the following morning. John Marshall himself had been dead for 41 years. He had built the empire, established its logic, embedded in its foundations the priorities, production above comfort, fiber above flesh, that had governed it from the beginning. He had died wealthy and celebrated, a member of parliament, a patron of learning, a man whose name was on buildings and institutions across Leeds. He had not lived to see a single year of the firm's long decline. The temple he had commissioned was completed 4 years before his death, and in those 4 years he had seen it at its best. New, astonishing, the largest room in the world, proof of everything he had set out to prove in 1788. History had been kind to him in one specific sense. It had allowed him to leave before the reckoning. James Garth Marshall had been less fortunate in his timing. He had lived long enough to understand what was happening, to watch the Irish competition take the orders, to feel the cotton tide coming in, to carry the weight of a business in decline without possessing the particular ruthlessness that might have saved it. He had died in 1873, 13 years before the closure, which meant he had been spared the auction, but not the knowledge that the auction was coming. He had built Temple Works, the most extraordinary thing the family ever did, and had then spent the remainder of his life presiding over the slow erosion of everything that made it necessary. It was not a comfortable legacy. John Richardson had been with the firm since the 1820s, more than 60 years. He had managed the daily operations through the wet spinning transition, through the plug riots, through the strike of 1871, through the retreating decades of the 1860s and 1870s when the family had grown distant and the business had grown difficult. He had installed his people in senior positions, had run the organization with the authority of a man who understood it better than anyone alive, had made decisions, some of them brutal, as the 1871 lockout demonstrated, that the family above him had sanctioned without always fully comprehending. He had been, in the most literal sense, the person who kept the temple functioning long after the family that built it had lost the will to do so. What Richardson received for this, for 60 years of institutional loyalty, for the knowledge he had accumulated and the crises he had managed, the historical record does not precisely say. He does not appear in the documents as a wealthy man. He does not appear in them as a celebrated one. He appears as a manager, essential while the enterprise required managing, invisible once it did not. If he was present on the day the last workers left, and it seems likely given everything that he was, nobody recorded what he did or said. The man who had effectively run Marshals of Leeds for 3 decades walked out of history with the same quiet anonymity with which he had entered it. And the temple stood. 66 glass domes open to the Yorkshire sky. Papyrus columns in their silent rows. The ventilation ducts cold for the first time since 1840. The carefully maintained 70 degrees Fahrenheit dissipating into the ordinary damp air of an autumn evening in Holbeck. The grass on the roof, still growing because grass does not stop for auctions, moved in the wind above the empty room below. John Marshall had wanted to build something that lasted. On this specific point, at least, he had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The empire was gone, the family was gone, the machinery was gone, the thread was gone. The children who had breathed the flax dust were grown and gray, and many of them already dead. The temple remained, as temples tend to. A building does not mourn. It simply stands and waits and absorbs whatever the years choose to put inside it. After James Rhodes acquired Temple Works in 1886, the Egyptian temple became a garment factory. The lotus columns that had once presided over 2,000 flax workers now looked down on sewing machines and cutting tables and bolts of cloth that had nothing to do with linen. The glass domes still admitted the same light. The ventilation ducts were no longer needed for humidity management and were left to their own devices. The hydraulic lift that had been invented to carry sheep to the roof fell into disuse. The roof itself, the extraordinary grass-covered surface that had been the most visible symbol of the mill's environmental ingenuity, was eventually stripped of its turf and sealed with asphalt, because asphalt is cheaper to maintain than a living system, and garment manufacturers are not, as a rule, in the business of keeping grass alive above their cutting tables. Rhodes's operation gave way in the middle decades of the 20th century to a mail-order warehouse company called K and Company. The building was now performing the most anonymous possible version of itself, a large covered space in which goods were stored and dispatched, distinguished from 1,000 similar spaces only by the hieroglyphs carved into its facade and the papyrus columns holding up its ceiling. Nobody loading parcels onto a delivery lorry in the 1950s was particularly exercised about the architectural significance of the room they were working in. The building was useful. That was sufficient. What nobody was doing across these decades of utilitarian occupation was maintaining it. This is how great buildings die, not in a single catastrophic event, but in the accumulation of small neglects. A roof seal that develops a hairline crack and is patched rather than replaced. A stone joint that allows moisture in through winter after winter until the freeze-thaw cycle has worked its way deep into the masonry. A structural tie that corrodes slowly, invisibly inside the fabric of the wall, losing tensile strength year by year until one day it fails entirely. Temple Works, listed as a Grade 1 building from 1951, placing it among the top 2.5% of all protected structures in England, was legally recognized as a building of exceptional importance. Recognition, however, does not pay for maintenance, and the succession of owners who occupied it after 1886 were, without exception, tenants of the building rather than custodians of it. By the early years of the 21st century, the consequences of this long neglect were becoming impossible to ignore. The fabric of the building was deteriorating in ways that went beyond ordinary wear. Moisture had penetrated the roof in multiple locations. The ornamental stonework of the facade, which the architect Bonamy had designed with the precision of a scholar who understood exactly what he was reproducing, was showing signs of serious structural stress. The Victorian Society, which campaigns for the preservation of 19th century architecture across England and Wales, placed Temple Works on its annual list of the 10 most endangered buildings in the country. English Heritage, the government's advisory body on listed buildings, described the carved stone elevation of the facade as probably the finest example of its kind in the entire region. Then, on an ordinary afternoon in 2008, one of the exterior stone pillars gave way. A slab of millstone grit fell from the parapet above and struck the pavement on Marshall Street. Nobody was standing directly beneath it at the moment it came down. The pillar from which it had fallen bowed outward, destabilized, and was subsequently assessed as having lost significant structural integrity. The collapse focused attention on the building with an urgency that years of reports and recommendations had failed to generate. Temple Works was not merely neglected. It was, in the technical language of the conservation bodies now paying very close attention to it, at risk. Attempts at a solution multiplied and failed in the years that followed with a regularity that began to feel almost designed. In November 2015, Burberry, the British fashion house whose heritage was rooted in textile manufacturing, announced plans to use Temple Works as a production facility. The announcement was received with considerable optimism by everyone who cared about the building's future. Within a year, the Brexit referendum had introduced a degree of economic uncertainty that Burberry's board was not prepared to absorb, and the plans were quietly shelved. By 2017, they had been abandoned entirely. The building was put up for auction that same year. The starting price was £1. £1 sterling for the building that John Marshall had constructed at a cost exceeding £200,000 in 1840 money. £1 for the largest single room in the world. £1 for the Grade 1 listed monument that English Heritage had described as irreplaceable, that the Victorian Society had called among the most threatened buildings in England, that had survived riots and strikes and a century of industrial decline and the collapse of the empire that built it. £1 because nobody could identify a buyer willing to pay more for the privilege of taking on what came with it. It was, as statements of historical irony go, almost too neat to be believed. Marshall had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth and converting it into permanence. The building he had left behind as proof of that permanence was now being offered to the market for less than the cost of a cup of tea on Brigade. The hammer that had closed the 1886 auction was raised again. The question was whether anyone would catch what fell beneath it. The buyer who eventually came forward paid more than £1. The new owner, a property development company called CEG, took possession of Temple Works with plans for its regeneration as part of the broader redevelopment of Leeds' South Bank. The stretch of former industrial land running along the River Aire that the city had been attempting, with varying degrees of success, to transform for 2 decades. CEG's estimate for the full restoration of the building came in at £35 million. It was a number that concentrated minds in ways that £1 had not. What followed was the slow, complicated business of finding that money. The grants, the public funding bids, the negotiations with heritage bodies and local authorities and government departments that constitute the unglamorous reality of saving a building that the market cannot save on its own. Historic England contributed £1 million in 2022 to make the building watertight and arrest the most immediate deterioration. It was enough to stop the bleeding. It was not enough to heal the wound. The decisive moment came from an unexpected direction. In March 2020, it was announced that Temple Works was under consideration as the northern home of the British Library, a permanent, purpose-built facility that would bring part of the National Collection out of London and establish a major cultural institution in the heart of a northern English city. The government's budget that same month committed £25 million toward the restoration, with the building's eventual use by the British Library as the condition of the funding. The total cost of the full conversion was estimated at £70 million. The gap between what had been committed and what was needed remained substantial. But for the first time in more than a century, Temple Works had something it had not possessed since the Marshall family walked away from it in 1886: a future. Consider what that future will look like if it is realized. The 66 conical glass domes that once raked light across 10,000 spindles will illuminate reading tables. The cast iron columns styled in the manner of papyrus bundles, the same columns that carried 4,000 tons of roof above the heads of children breathing flax dust, will stand in a public space that anyone may enter without charge, without appointment, without any qualification beyond the desire to be there. The ventilation ducts that were engineered to maintain the precise atmospheric conditions required by linen thread will carry air through a building whose atmosphere is now calibrated to the preservation of books. The hydraulic lift that was invented because sheep cannot climb stairs will, presumably, carry readers rather than livestock. The physical structure will be the same. The purpose will be entirely different. And in that difference, between what the building was made for and what it is being remade for, lies the question that Temple Works has been posing, in one form or another, since the day John Marshall first imagined it. Marshall built this temple to demonstrate something about himself. It was an act of self-presentation on an industrial scale, the statement of a man who had come from a draper's shop on Briggate and needed the world to understand how far he had traveled. The beauty of the building was real, but it was not disinterested. It was purchased, like everything Marshall purchased, because it served a purpose. The purpose was power made visible. And the power it made visible rested, as power in the Industrial Revolution almost invariably did, on the labor of people who had not chosen it freely and could not easily refuse it. The children who breathed the flax dust inside that room did not choose to be there. The women who worked 72 hours a week under its domes did not negotiate their terms. The men who were locked out in 1871 for the act of asking for 10% more of what their labor was worth did not have access to the levers of power that the Marshalls took for granted. The building that stands on Marshall Street today is inseparable from those facts. Its beauty does not cancel them. Its Grade 1 listing does not resolve them. Its conversion into a library does not by itself constitute an answer to the question of what was done inside it. And yet, there is something in the specific nature of its future use that resists easy cynicism. A library is not a monument to the man who built the building that houses it. A library belongs in the most fundamental sense to the people who use it. It is a place where knowledge, the thing that John Marshall accumulated privately, in correspondence with engineers and political economists and the members of learned societies from which his own workers were largely excluded, becomes available to anyone who walks through the door. The Leeds Mechanics Institute that Marshall helped to found was an act of patrician generosity, offered on patrician terms. The British Library North, if it opens in Temple Works, will be something categorically different, a public institution in a public building, on a public street, in a part of Leeds that Marshall's workers would have recognized. Whether that constitutes justice is a question this story cannot answer. The children are long dead. The families are dispersed. The thread is cold. What remains is the building, the papyrus columns and the glass domes and the hieroglyphs that an Egyptologist carved into a factory facade on a back street in Holbeck because a flax spinner from Brig Gate wanted people to stop and stare. They are still stopping. They are still staring. Perhaps that, in the end, is the only kind of permanence that any of this was ever going to achieve. Not justice, not redemption, just the stubborn, indifferent, extraordinary fact of the building itself, still standing after everything, waiting to be of use.